Welcome to the Cognito Pod. We're going to be taking a deep dive into tariffs today.
Okay.
And, lots been happening with them. So
Yeah, definitely. Tariffs are always a hot topic.
always a hot topic. And especially with all the changes happening in 2025. So we thought we'd really break it down.
Yeah, sounds good.
So first off, just what are they? Like, what are tariffs and how do they work?
Well, at its core, a tariff is basically like a tax, specifically on goods coming into a country from somewhere else.
Okay.
So when a company wants to import something like, say, electronics from China or, cars from Japan,
Right.
they got to pay this extra fee on top of the regular price.
Gotcha. So it's like a border tax, basically.
Exactly, a border tax, yeah.
And I know there are different kinds, right? Like, how do they figure out how much this tax is?
Yeah, so there are two main types. One is called an ad valorem tariff, and that's based on the value of the goods.
Yep.
So say there's a 20% tariff on a gadget that costs $100. Then the importer would pay an extra $20 in tariff.
Yeah, makes sense.
Then the other type is called a specific tariff, and that's a flat fee per unit.
Oh, okay.
So like there might be a $2 tariff on every barrel of oil coming in, regardless of how much the oil itself costs.
I see.
So depends on the specific good in the policy, really.
So all this money, this extra fee that companies are paying, where does it go? Like, who's getting this tariff money?
It goes to the government, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection collects it, and then it becomes part of the federal budget.
Okay, so it's government revenue.
Yeah,
then.
exactly.
So to give our listeners a clearer picture, let's say a company is importing, I don't know, a TV from China. It costs $200 and there's a 20% tariff. What happens then?
So in that case, the importer would have to pay an extra $40 on top of the $200.
Right.
So that TV now effectively costs them $240.
Okay, and then so what happens? Do they just eat that cost?
Well, they have options. They could absorb it and, have a smaller profit margin. They could pass the cost along to the retailer, who might then raise the price for the consumer.
Right, so we might end up paying more for that TV.
Exactly. Or sometimes they try to get creative, like, sourcing cheaper components or something to offset the tariff.
Interesting. So it can have these ripple effects throughout the supply chain.
Definitely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that tariffs can target specific countries or specific goods.
Right.
How does that work? Like, who decides who gets hit with a tariff and for what?
So it's ultimately government agencies that set these tariff rates and who they apply to based on different trade laws and policies.
Okay.
So, for example, they might put a tariff on steel imports to protect domestic steel producers.
Right.
Or they could target goods from a specific country if there's a trade dispute going on.
I see. So it can be a tool to kind of influence trade and protect certain industries.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful tool
Yeah.
with a lot of implications.
Yeah. And speaking of history, I think it's important to note that tariffs aren't a new thing, right? They've been around for a long time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They go way back.
Way back. So I know in the 1800s, tariffs were actually a really big deal for the U.S. government, right?
Huge. Yeah, they were a major source of revenue for the federal government back then, sometimes even more than half their income.
Wow. That's make it.
Like one of the first laws Congress passed, the Tariff Act of 1789, was all about taxing imports to fund the new government.
Wow. So it was like their main way of making money?
Pretty much, yeah.
That's a huge difference from today, obviously.
Yeah, things have shifted a lot since then.
So what happens? Like, how did tariffs go from being this like primary source of revenue to being, I guess, less important now?
Well, there were a few key turning points. One of the big ones was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930.
Oh, right. I've heard of that.
Yeah, it was intended to protect American industries during the Great Depression. It raised tariff rates significantly, like up to an average of 20%.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and most economists agree that it actually backfired.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it contributed to a massive decline in global trade. Like some estimates say it dropped by as much as 67%.
Oh, wow.
And that actually worsened the Depression.
So it had the opposite effect of what they were hoping for.
Pretty much, yeah.
So after that, I guess, people started realizing that maybe super high tariffs weren't such a good idea.
Yeah, that was definitely a lesson learned.
So did things change after World War II then?
Yeah, after World War II, there was a big push towards more open trade and lower barriers.
Okay.
So there was these international agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later became the World Trade Organization, or WTO.
Right, I've heard of those.
Yeah, and the goal of these agreements was to gradually reduce tariffs worldwide.
I see.
And it worked. Like by the 1990s, the average U.S. tariff rate was under 3%.
Wow, so a huge drop from the Smoot-Hawley days.
Oh, yeah, massive difference.
So I guess that was kind of the trend for a while, like lower and lower tariffs.
Yeah, for a while, it seemed like free trade was the dominant philosophy.
But then I guess more recently, we've seen tariffs kind of making a comeback, haven't we?
We have, yeah.
Like starting around 2018?
Yeah. Around 2018, we started seeing an uptick in tariffs, particularly on goods from China and also on things like steel and aluminum.
Right.
And by 2023, tariff revenue had climbed to $79 billion.
Okay, so a substantial amount, but still, I guess not as much as when they were the main source of income for the government.
No, definitely not at that level. Income taxes are still the biggest source of revenue by far.
Right.
But tariffs are definitely playing a more prominent role in trade policy again.
Okay, so let's zoom in on 2023 then. You mentioned $79 billion in tariff revenue.
Yeah.
Where was that mostly coming from?
A big chunk of it, like $77 billion, was from tariffs on Chinese goods.
Oh, wow. Okay.
These were implemented under Section 301 of the U.S. trade law.
Okay. And what's that, just for our listeners who might not be familiar?
It's basically a law that lets the U.S. take action if they think another country is engaging in unfair trade practices.
Okay.
And in this case, the tariffs targeted things like electronics, machinery, semiconductors, stuff like that. And it was mainly due to trade disputes with China, especially over intellectual property.
Okay, so kind of trying to level the playing field, I guess?
Yeah, that's the idea.
So if you were buying, say, a smartphone from China in 2023, how much extra might you be paying because of these tariffs?
So a smartphone that costs, say, $100 could have had a 25% tariff slapped on it, so that's an extra $25.
Wow. Okay, so it's a noticeable difference.
Yeah, definitely.
And were there any other notable tariffs in effect in 2023?
Yeah, there were also tariffs on steel and aluminum imports.
Oh, right. I remember hearing about those.
Yeah, those were 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, and they were mainly targeting countries like Canada, Japan, the EU.
Okay.
The goal there was to try and boost U.S. production of steel and aluminum.
Protect domestic industries.
Exactly.
Now, I think it's interesting to see what happens when a tariff is removed, right? Like what kind of impact that has on prices.
Yeah, it can be pretty dramatic.
I remember reading that there was a tariff on washing machines that expired in early 2023.
That's right.
And what happened to the prices?
They dropped significant, like according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, prices went down by about 34% within months.
Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, so it really shows you how tariffs can directly affect what consumers end up paying.
Right, right. So even if we don't see the word tariff on our receipts, it's definitely baked into the prices.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So just to put that $79 billion in perspective, how did that compare to the total federal revenue in 2023?
So total federal revenue was about $4.4 trillion that year, and the $79 billion from tariffs represented about 1.8% of that.
Okay, so it's a decent chunk of change, but obviously not the main driver of the government's finances.
Right. Income taxes are still the big kahuna.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 2025 now, where things really start to heat up in the tariff world.
Definitely. A lot of changes happening.
A lot of changes. So what's happened so far this year?
Well, starting February 1st, 2025, most goods imported from Canada and Mexico got hit with a 25% tariff.
Wow. Okay, so that's a big one. Our neighbors to the north and south.
Yeah, a significant change for sure.
And Canadian energy products like oil, were they included in that?
They had a lower tariff, 10% on those.
Oh, okay. Still significant, though.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then just a month later, in March, there were even more changes, right?
Yeah, on March 4th, the tariff on all goods from China went up.
Oh, wow. From what to what?
It went from 10% to 20%.
Okay, so a doubling of the tariff on everything coming from China.
Yeah, a pretty big escalation there.
So we're talking about some major increases here affecting some of our biggest trading partners.
Right.
Were there any exceptions to these new tariffs?
Yeah, actually, they introduced some exemptions on March 6th.
Okay, for who?
So it was for goods from Canada and Mexico that meet certain rules. Basically, 50% of Mexican goods and 30% of Canadian goods are exempt.
Okay, and what are the rules they have to meet?
They have to comply with the rules of origin under the North American Trade Agreement.
Okay.
Which basically means that a certain percentage of the product's components have to come from North America.
I see. So it's kind of encouraging, more integrated supply chains within North America.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So if you're buying, say, a car made in Mexico, how would you know if it's exempt from the tariff or not?
Well, it depends on the specifics of the car, like where the parts are sourced from.
Right.
But for example, a Toyota Tacoma assembled in Mexico might be exempt if a big portion of its parts, like the engine or transmission, are made in North America.
Okay, so there's some nuance there. It's not just a blanket tariff on everything.
Right, there are exceptions and rules.
And what about steel and aluminum? Any changes to those tariffs in 2025?
There were, yeah, on March 12th.
Okay, what happened?
They got rid of all the previous exceptions and just put a flat 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, no matter where they came from.
Wow, okay, so no more special treatment for certain countries?
Nope, everyone's paying the same rate now.
So to give our listeners a real-world example, if you were buying a steel beam from Canada, how much would that 25% tariff add to the cost?
So let's say the beam cost $1,000. The 25% tariff would be an extra $250.
Okay, so a significant jump.
Yeah, it's a big chunk of change.
And I think it's important to note that the U.S. imports a ton of stuff, right? So these tariffs are affecting a lot of goods.
Oh yeah, a massive amount.
I think in 2023, the total value of imports was something like $3.1 trillion.
Wow, that's a lot of potential tariffs.
Yeah, so even with exemptions for some Canadian and Mexican goods, these changes are still broadening the impact of tariffs quite a bit.
Definitely, it's a big shift in policy.
Okay, so let's talk about some other potential tariff changes that were being considered. I think there was talk of some new tariffs coming into effect on April 1st, 2025.
That's right, there were some proposals floating around.
Yeah, and what was the general idea behind those?
The initial idea was to implement something called reciprocal tariffs.
Okay, and what does that mean?
Basically, it meant that the U.S. would match the tariff rates that other countries were imposing on U.S. goods.
Oh, I see. So kind of like a tit-for-tat approach.
Yeah, you could say that.
So, for example, if Germany decided to put a 40% tariff on cars coming in from the U.S.,
right,
then the U.S. would turn around and put a 40% tariff on cars coming in from Germany.
Exactly, kind of like a you hit me, I hit you back situation.
Gotcha. So, but it sounds like that initial idea maybe evolved a bit.
You did, yeah.
How so?
So the discussion shifted more towards a more targeted approach. They were talking about these reciprocal levies.
Oh, okay.
But instead of matching every tariff, these levies would be aimed at a specific list of countries.
Oh, okay. And who was on this list?
It was called the Dirty 15 list.
The Dirty 15. Okay. And what made these countries dirty?
Basically, they were countries that were seen as having particularly high tariffs on U.S. exports.
I see. So kind of penalizing them for not playing fair in the eyes of the U.S. government, at least.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So how would these targeted levies work in practice? Like, can you give us an example?
Sure. So right now, Canadian potash faces a 25% tariff coming into the U.S.
Okay.
But if Canada wasn't on the Dirty 15 list, that rate might be lowered to 10%.
Okay.
On the other hand, if Japan has really high tariffs on, say, U.S. tech products, then they might suddenly see a new tariff on their semiconductors coming into the U.S.
I see. So it's kind of a way to incentivize countries to lower their own tariffs.
Exactly. A way to try and nudge them in the right direction.
Now, it sounds like the specifics of these potential April levies were still being worked out.
Yeah, the details were still a bit fuzzy.
Like which exact goods and countries would be targeted and what the rates would be.
Right. A lot of it was still up in the air.
But it seemed like the general trend was moving away from these broad, sweeping tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. And more towards a more precise, targeted approach.
Exactly. More of a scalpel than a sledgehammer.
Okay, so with all these tariff changes and potential changes, I think a lot of people are wondering what the impact is going to be.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions.
Like, first off, how much money is the government actually going to make from all these tariffs?
That's a big one.
And then, of course, the big question, who ultimately pays for these tariffs?
Right. Where does the burden fall?
So let's start with the revenue side. You mentioned that in 2023, tariff revenue was $79 billion.
Yeah.
What's the estimate for how much the government could bring in with the 2025 changes?
So with the changes that were already in place, like the increased tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, the estimates were somewhere between $150 and $200 billion annually.
Wow. Okay, so a significant jump.
Yeah, more than double.
And that's taking into account those exemptions for certain Canadian and Mexican goods.
Right. It's factoring in those exemptions.
Okay, and what about if those proposed April levies were to be implemented? Well, that's where the estimates got even bigger, like up to $250 to $300 billion yearly.
Wow. So potentially a huge source of revenue.
Could be, yeah.
But of course, this is all based on projections and assumptions, right? Like how much stuff is actually going to be imported and all that.
Exactly. There are a lot of moving parts.
So while income taxes are still the bread and butter for the government's budget,
Yeah, definitely.
it seems like tariffs are becoming a more and more significant piece of the pie.
They are, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that other big question. Who's actually footing the bill for these tariffs?
Right, so the first thing to understand is that the importers are the ones who initially pay the tariffs.
Okay, so the company's bringing the goods into the country.
Exactly.
So let's say, I don't know, a clothing company imports $10 million worth of textiles from Mexico, and there's that 25% tariff in place.
Right.
How much would they have to shell out in tariffs?
Well, in that case, they'd be looking at a tariff bill of $2.5 million.
Oh, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it can be a significant cost for these companies.
So what do they do with that cost? Like, do they just absorb it?
Well, they have a few options.
Okay.
One option is to just eat the cost and, accept a smaller profit margin.
Right, which obviously isn't ideal.
Not really, especially if the tariffs are high.
So what else can they do?
Another option is to pass the cost along the supply chain.
Okay.
So they might raise the price they charge to the retailers, and then the retailers, in turn, might raise the price for the consumers.
So we end up paying more for those clothes.
Exactly, or at least that's one possibility.
And is there a third option?
Yeah, the third option is to try and adjust their supply chains.
Okay.
So instead of importing from Mexico, maybe they start looking for suppliers in other countries that don't have tariffs.
Oh, interesting. So it can actually lead to companies shifting their sourcing.
Definitely, we've seen that happen before.
Really? Like when?
After those 2018 tariffs on China, imports from China actually dropped by about 3.1%, as some companies started sourcing from other places like Vietnam or Taiwan.
Wow. So it can have a real impact on global trade patterns.
Absolutely.
And with the new tariffs in 2025, do we expect to see similar shifts?
Yeah, it's possible. Like, for example, a retailer that used to get their lumber from Canada might now decide to source it domestically to avoid that 25% tariff.
Okay, so potentially good news for U.S. lumber producers.
Yeah, they could benefit from that.
But it also means that the cost of lumber might go up for everyone else.
That's a possibility, yeah.
So at the end of the day, it seems like consumers often end up bearing at least some of the burden of these tariffs, even if it's not always obvious.
That's often the case.
Like that $40 toolkit from China might still be $40 at Walmart, but maybe they had to cut some corners on the quality to keep the price down.
Right, or maybe they absorb some of the cost themselves.
But then for smaller retailers, maybe they don't have that leverage, so they have to raise the price to $48, and that might mean fewer people buy it.
It's a complex web of effects.
Yeah, so many factors at play. So let's dive into the impacts of all this. We know tariffs have consequences. What are we seeing in terms of immediate impacts, especially on prices?
Oh, we're already seeing prices shift, especially for things directly affected by those new tariffs.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, lumber is a big one. With that 25% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber, it's estimated that it could add like $5,000 to the cost of building a new house.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's hitting home buyers pretty hard.
Yeah, if you're in the market for a new house, you're probably feeling it.
And what about cars? A lot of people are worried about car prices.
Right, and for good reason. The tariffs on parts from Mexico and Canada, those that aren't exempt, could mean the average price of a new vehicle goes up by about $2,700.
Oof, that's a pretty big chunk of change.
Yeah, it's not insignificant.
And I think gas prices are another concern for a lot of people, especially with those tariffs on Canadian oil.
Definitely. In the Midwest, where they rely heavily on Canadian oil, gas prices could jump by 10 to 20 cents a gallon.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about a noticeable difference at the pump.
Yeah, people are going to feel that.
And I know food prices are always a sensitive topic. Are there any examples there?
Yeah, avocados are a good example. A lot of avocados come from Mexico.
Right.
And if they're not exempt from those tariffs, the price of a $2 avocado could go up by 50 cents.
So your guacamole is going to cost you more.
That's right. Everything's connected.
Okay, so there are definitely some losers in this tariff game, like home buyers, car buyers, people who need to fill up their gas tanks.
Right.
But I guess there are some winners too, right?
Yeah, there are always two sides to the coin.
So who's coming out ahead?
Well, domestic producers in the industries that are being protected by the tariffs are definitely seeing some benefits.
Like who?
For example, U.S. steel and aluminum producers, they've been doing pretty well since those tariffs were put in place back in 2018.
Okay, what kind of benefits are we talking about?
Well, their output increased by something like $2.8 billion.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and they've been able to hire more workers, raise their prices, that kind of thing.
So from their perspective, the tariffs are working as intended.
It seems so, yeah.
But I guess for companies that rely on steel and aluminum, they're not so happy about it.
Right, it's a mixed bag for sure.
Like you mentioned car manufacturers earlier, how have they been affected?
Yeah, car makers are a good example of the downstream impacts.
Okay.
Because they use a lot of steel and aluminum, those tariffs have actually cost them an estimated $3.4 billion.
Wow. So it's kind of a zero-sum game in a way. Like one industry benefits, another one suffers.
It can feel that way sometimes, yeah.
And what about retail? How are retailers dealing with all these price increases?
Well, it really depends on the size and the power of the retailer.
Okay.
Like big companies like Walmart, they have a lot of negotiating power with their suppliers.
Right. They can kind of dictate terms.
Yeah, so they might be able to absorb some of the tariff costs or convince the suppliers to lower their prices.
So that $40 toolkit from China might stay at $40.
Possibly, yeah.
But smaller retailers like mom and pop shops, they probably don't have that same leverage.
Right. They might not have much choice but to raise their prices to cover the increased costs.
So that $40 toolkit might become a $48 toolkit.
Exactly.
And who knows if people are still willing to buy it at that price.
Right. It could affect their sales.
So it's a tough situation for a lot of businesses.
It is, yeah. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of potential downsides.
So we've talked about the immediate effects, things like price increases. But what about the bigger picture? Like, what kind of long-term impacts could these tariffs have on the U.S. economy as a whole?
Well, that's where things get even more complex and harder to predict with certainty. But there are some potential long-term effects that economists are concerned about.
Like what?
One of the big worries is a potential reduction in GDP, or gross domestic product.
Okay, and for our listeners who aren't economists, can you explain what that means?
Sure. GDP is basically a measure of the total value of goods and services produced in a country. It's a way of gauging how well the economy is doing overall.
Got it. So how much could GDP potentially shrink because of these tariffs?
Well, some estimates put it at anywhere from 0.5% to 1.4%, which might not sound like a lot, but in real terms, we're talking about hundreds of billions, even trillions of dollars.
Whoa, that's a huge amount.
Yeah, and the reason for this potential decline is that tariffs can lead to decreased spending power.
How so?
Well, if prices go up because of tariffs, people have less money to spend on other things. And if people are spending less, businesses are making less money, and the overall economy slows down.
Makes sense. So it's kind of a domino effect.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of job shifts.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, tariffs can lead to job growth in some sectors, but job losses in others.
Okay, can you give us an example?
Sure. We've already talked about how U.S. steel producers have benefited from the tariffs. They've been able to hire more workers, and that's good news for the steel industry.
Right.
But at the same time, industries that rely heavily on exports could suffer because of retaliation from other countries.
Tell me.
Yeah, if other countries feel like the U.S. is being unfair with its tariffs, they might retaliate by putting tariffs on U.S. goods.
Oh, I see. So it could kind of spark a trade war.
Potentially, yeah. And that's what happened back in 2018 when China retaliated against U.S. tariffs by putting tariff on soybeans.
Right, I remember that. And how did that affect U.S. farmers?
Well, it cost them a lot of money, something like $27 billion through 2019. And there's a risk that something similar could happen now, maybe with Mexico retaliating against U.S. corn exports.
So we could see job losses in agriculture and other export-oriented sectors?
Potentially, yeah.
And what about inflation? Everyone's worried about inflation these days. Could these tariffs make things worse?
We could, yeah. Some economists are predicting a one-time inflation spike of anywhere from 1.4% to 5% on goods.
Okay, so not a huge increase, but still noticeable.
Right, and this spike would mainly be driven by the higher prices of imported goods.
Makes sense, but hopefully wouldn't last forever.
Hopefully not. It really depends on how things play out with these trade wars. If things escalate and we get into a tit-for-tat situation with tariffs going back and forth, then inflation could become more persistent.
Oh, that wouldn't be good.
No, it wouldn't.
And we talked earlier about how these tariffs could lead to companies shifting their supply chains. What kind of long-term impact could that have?
Well, it could lead to more domestic sourcing, which could be good for U.S. producers, but it could also mean higher costs for businesses, at least in the short term, as they adjust to these new supply chains.
Right.
And it could also take time for these new supply chains to be established, which could lead to disruptions and delays.
So all in all, it sounds like the long-term effects of these tariffs could be pretty significant.
They could be, yeah. We're potentially looking at a slightly smaller economy, shifting jobs, and persistently higher costs for consumers.
Not exactly a rosy picture.
Not really. But it's important to remember that these are just projections, and a lot can change depending on how things unfold.
Right. Always good to keep that in mind. Thanks for listening to the Cognito Pod.